Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. Welcome back to webinar number 2, implementing effective grading and feedback actions to drive student learning, specifically for Worthington City Schools. Again, my name is Dave Nagel. I'm really excited and honored to have a chance to present to a lot of you this coming May 31st and June 2nd, and this of 2016, although some of you might be watching these webinars after those dates, but this is webinar 2 of around a 15 to 16 part series. We're not exactly sure how many we're going to have, but at least we're going to continue on. And so this second webinar addresses one of the, I think, critical issues that comes into a topic around grading. And I will tell you personally, as someone who's done a lot of work in grading, I'm still challenged at times by the things that we are finding out now that maybe we realize maybe have worked and should have worked, because they challenge the traditions that we're used to. And so we've got to acknowledge one thing in our profession: far too often, not just in grading, but traditions have trumped evidence. And why grading change is such a difficult topic is really addressed in that idea that all of us have had, as a term I use, grades done to us. And we have to look at what are some of the things we've done with grading or anything in our profession that actually might work to replicate them. But what are some things maybe that are based on tradition and not evidence? So again, a little bit about me, and again, after about the second or third webinar, I will back off on any of the introductions, but my career has been spent specifically working as a practitioner with secondary schools. While I've been a presenter now for over 12 years with K-12 audiences, my background is in secondary education, so I understand the challenges that middle and high school teachers face. And while as a former middle and high school teacher and administrator, I want to be real transparent, our challenges are just different than our elementary colleagues. They're not any greater, but they are different. And so when I put us through some conversations around how we look at grading and feedback, I am looking at it through the lens of the idea of I taught biology for the most part. Most of my career, I had a course that I taught in the science department, and it wasn't my job necessarily to consider what students were learning in other subjects. And so I do understand that difficult nature at times of the comprehensive high school or middle school structure. Again, my high school and middle school were large. Bigger doesn't mean better. But when you have that many students, you certainly gain an appreciation for when you're making whole-scale changes in practice and culture, that it takes time. And we have to be able to have an understanding of what these practices and ideas look like, because they're going to look different when applied from English to math to science. And even in science, which is what I taught, might look different from biology to chemistry, and even across 2 biology classrooms. Hopefully by now you'll understand the drill that I'll hit every time we come together, which is to make sure we have our working handout available to be able to follow through on some of the activities we're going to complete. And then my email, as well as my Twitter handle, and any questions or thoughts that you have throughout this series that you want to send to me, please feel free to do so, and I look forward to any of the dialogue that can take place. Certainly we can't do it in real time with these webinars, but we can electronically. So I want you to take a moment and complete a short activity. You see it in your handout. I want you to take a few minutes and jot down what are the traits and characteristics of students that are of A and B students. What are the things that they do? What are the traits they possess? What are the behaviors that they bring into the conversation? What do you know about their parents, their background? And I want you to do the same thing for the students that, for the most part, receive D and F. When you think D and F students and you close your eyes for a moment, who do you see? What do those students look like, act like? What are some of their behaviors? What do you know about their parents? Take a few moments and pause the recording. I'm going to pause briefly to let you do so, but certainly you're going to need to pause it long enough to complete this activity, and please do so before you continue on. Welcome back. I'm assuming that you've completed the last activity. Please pause the recording if you haven't done so, and jot down your ideas related to traits for A and B and D and F students. But I want to talk a little bit around why grades have lacked meaning. And certainly tradition trumps evidence. It's something I'm going to talk about here in just a moment with some examples. Specifically within the research, that if we take time to look at it, it might challenge us a little bit based on what we think. There's a desire for power and control. We as educators and teachers especially have had a lot taken away from us in the last decade. But what are some things that we really want to consider when it comes to that point? That we have given some things up, and we have to acknowledge that that means maybe we're holding on to things a little bit stronger that we still have control over. And one of those is grades. How often have our schools who have PLCs and data team structures and teacher-based teams, as we have in Worthington, really had honest, consistent dialogue around grading, and not just scoring papers and collaboratively scoring, but really looking at what are the assignments and tasks that we're actually using to grade and assess students, and are they at the aligned rigor level, to collaborate around those. And often grades focus on process criteria. We put the same amount of effort and notation with our students based on how they completed their graphic organizers or did things on time or did their homework, which should have been for practice, as we do on the final product. When we do that, we certainly confuse students, or we put more emphasis than we should on the process to get to the product. We don't care how many times the baseball player on the team spent in the batting cages or fielding ground balls. Those were processes. Bottom line is he's got to be able to perform in the game. And it wasn't as if each fielder had the same number of ground balls hit to them. We think about how we grade sometimes. We put students through the same activities and sort of the same processes and sort of grade and evaluate those equally. And then we have some false assumptions, which go back to the whole premise of this webinar around traditions trumping evidence. I want to highlight something. One of the specific studies that I noted in my book that comes up from a conversation that takes place in a lot of schools around minimum grading, the idea that we're going to give a 50 for instead of a 0. And I completely understand the pushback. But I want to ask us first to look at the question, does minimum grading work? Now, I will tell you right now, the reason why I'm against the idea of giving a 50 instead of a 0 is the perception gets in the way of reality. The perception is that we're giving students something for nothing. No, what we're really doing is we're trying to accurately weight. We're trying to make sure that we don't disproportionately weight any one piece of evidence. And the same conversation would take place if it was a really, really easy task and we give the students 100 points for it, or we give them and they don't complete it and we take away all of those points. But one district, if we look at Carafaro's research, over 7 years, and a lot of times we in our classrooms think about one student or one situation, or we have a hypothesis of what would happen. We looked at one district over the course of 7 years. And by implementing minimum grading with fidelity, they saved about 925 credits, or 142 per year. The total number of grades issued during that 7-year period was almost 350,000. And saving, in terms of not having students repeat courses because of that, was about 150,000 per year, over 1.2 million. Now, in 2016 and beyond, we are always going to be cognizant and conscientious of financial resources and making sure we're a little bit more intentional with how we monitor the finances with what we do in our schools. But the pushback would be, well, if we have minimum grading, we're going to have students become lazy and different, and certainly we're going to reduce achievement. Well, if that was the case in this particular district over 7 years, then why would their MCAS results, the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, in math and language arts gone up 20 and 17% respectively, which prior to the next generation assessments of Park and Smarter Balance, the Massachusetts assessment was always known and defined as one of the most rigorous state assessments. The bottom line is what we can find within this particular study, which was done over the course of a long period of time, not just in isolation. The more often students stayed in the game, the more they didn't feel that they were completely defeated, the more effort they put in, the more they focused on their learning and learned over time. So we have to ask ourselves, when we think about the idea of a minimum grade, and I want to be very intentional, giving 50 instead of 0 sends the wrong message. We could do the same thing and say, the highest grade is 50. You can still give a 0. But the bottom line is, how often have we watched in athletics or other types of competitions, the longer the underdog stays in the game, the more effort they put in. And since no two learners are going to learn at the same speed, is it very likely that a lot of the students in this particular example, which might happen in our classrooms in Worthington, might need to learn things over time. And I might continue to try to learn if I don't feel that my grade has been so disproportionately average to where I have no chance to pass, then maybe that effort to learn goes away. We have to really ask ourselves when we think about tradition and evidence, and if they're always aligned. So a couple other final points around this idea of why we might want to consider changing grading and feedback practices. And I believe the 4 things we need to start with are why. We should always start with why we should do things. First one is that expectations impact grades. Several studies, one that was specific recently that looked at the number of students, or in the study, the students who had like traits of their teacher, their personality traits were the same, how much higher their GPAs were, and it was actually 1.2. So students with a GPA of 2.8 or 3.8, that was the difference between 1.6 or 2.6 based on the traits they had compared to their teacher. The more their traits were similar, the higher their GPAs. What we can learn from that is, okay, is it possible that we connect with students who we get along with more and we have similar traits? Absolutely. Might they get better feedback? Might they get more attention? Or might we be biased when we're scoring and assessing them? Second one is we can't gauge effort. I often see that on report cards, or I'll see a teacher make that statement, and I understand it. But it is impossible to determine the cognitive or physical effort that another person puts out compared to a task. Now, what we can do is say, well, in the last time you wrote an essay, you wrote 5 paragraphs. This time you only put 1. Certainly, we can say that there's a lack of consistency in terms of what you put together, but we can't gauge effort. What actually happens here is similar to what happens in number 1. Students that are behind, that put forth a lot of, quote, effort because they need to survive, often have their grades inflated. And students that might not need to put forth the same, with my fingers, effort as other students, maybe get penalized. The next one is grades or feedback. And grades are feedback not just for teachers and for students and parents, but for subsequent teachers. You know, when I get a student in my class who's going to be in my chemistry or my English 11 class or my advanced trigonometry class, whatever that is, I'm looking at their grades and assuming that tells me the level of rigor and understanding that they've been able to demonstrate. Far too often, it's not the case because number 4, inflation is as much of an issue as deflation. In fact, that's the bigger issue. The conversation often lends to making sure we penalize students, and are we going to have the conversation if we should take off points if it's late. Bigger conversation is if we're calling compliance and well-behaved students proficient because they're completing all their tasks, whether or not they're correct or not, whether or not getting help or not. How many students are in our classes right now that are not on grade level, that are struggling, and we're struggling with them, but their parents have a bumper sticker on their minivan from the previous year? Those are why we have to dig in to look at why when we examine where our grading practices are, and not make whole-scale changes without having deep conversation, looking at what the impact will be, but why we should do it in the first place. So again, this is one I get a little bit excited about because I feel this is as important as any, that we dig into making sure traditions don't trump evidence. We dig into the whys of why we should have this conversation. So 2 short reflection questions. Number 1, how might the perceptions you have about how your students are graded and how you are graded influence you as a teacher or administrator? And how do you view these 4 whys that I mentioned? And consider how you and your peers, specifically on your teacher-based team, will view the importance of effective and accurate grading practices. Not to just completely change a new policy and mandate certain tactics for every teacher in every Worthington classroom, but to maybe dig in terms of why we should have this conversation and make it part of our teacher-based team discussion on a consistent basis moving forward. As always, I appreciate your time and attention and engagement on these webinars. Please, if you have any questions, send them to me at dave.nagel@corwinlearning.net. See my cell phone number, and as always, you can check out my website, gradingforimpact.com. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.